Right, this is the prep for the mock paper in biology, paper 2. Right, so just to start off, homeostasis is the regulation of internal conditions inside the body. Right, so that just means the conditions in the body are kept the same, and that's important because for enzyme activity, basically. So enzymes have got to have all the right conditions for them to function properly. So we call that the optimum activity. So one thing that has to be regulated, which means just kept at the right level, is blood glucose concentration. So that's how much glucose is in your blood. Blood glucose concentration is controlled by the organ, the pancreas. And that's also a gland because it releases hormones. And we're going to look at which hormones it releases in a sec. Excuse me. So if blood glucose concentration is too high, this is what the pancreas does. It releases a hormone called insulin, right? Insulin causes glucose in the blood to move into liver and muscle cells. So all the glucose in the blood, well not all of it, some of it, will move into liver and muscle cells. And in them liver and muscle cells, the insulin will cause glucose to be converted to a storage molecule called glycogen. And that's just loads of glucose stacked together to be stored. So that's what happens if the blood glucose concentration is too high. Now, if it's too low, something different happens. It's basically the opposite effect. So the pancreas releases a hormone called glucagon, right? And if you need to remember that, just remember, if the blood glucose concentration is too low, there's not enough glucose, so all the glucose is gone, so glucagon. Right? Glucagon causes glycogen in the liver and muscles, in the liver and muscle cells, to be converted into glucose, which is then re-released into the blood to bring it back up. Right, so glycogen is converted to glucose, so it has the opposite effect of insulin, glucagon does. And then all that glucose that's produced from that conversion from glycogen to glucose is then re-released into the blood to bring it back up to the right level. So if you want to give it a quick pause and try and answer these questions, just to recap that, it's an important one, and the G's can get a bit confusing. But once you've got your head around them, it's not too bad. Right. So the next bit is diabetes. You've got to know what the different types of diabetes are and sort of interpret different information around them diseases. So type 1, the pancreas doesn't produce insulin at all, right? So the pancreas does not produce that hormone insulin. Whereas type 2, the pancreas does produce insulin, but the liver and muscle cells don't respond to it, right? So they don't take any of the glucose out of the blood to convert it into that glycogen. So the type 2 is the one you'll usually see older people get, and people that have ate a lot of sugar, have got high sugar diets, because their cells stop responding to that insulin because it's been produced so much. So here we've got an example of a question that you could be asked around diabetes, and it's to do with interpreting graphs as well. So the graph shows blood glucose concentration. I'm going to be laser on, or pen. There you go. Right, so on this side, on this y-axis, is blood glucose concentration, and the unit's not important at the minute, and that's time on the x-axis. So it shows it 5 hours after eating a sugary meal. So we'll call this time 0. So this is when the sugary meal was eaten. So that's when the person 1 and person 2 ate a sugary meal. So it's asking you which person has diabetes, and how do you know that? So there's a few key points we need to address why we know which person has diabetes. So if you want to give it a quick pause and try and work it out for yourself, then we'll go through it in a sec. Right, so key things that we need to point out. Person 1's blood glucose is higher than normal before eating. So person 1 is the one with diabetes. So you see at time 0, before eating, person 1's blood glucose is much higher than person 2's. Right, person 1's blood glucose was very high after the meal, so you can see that person 2 peaked at around 120 there, whereas person 1 got right the way up to 200 in the blood glucose concentration. So what will happen there in person 2 is that as soon as it starts to spike a little bit, the pancreas will release insulin and bring it back down. Right? And also, person 1's blood glucose didn't return to normal after 5 hours. So you can see within sort of under 2 hours, person 2's blood glucose returned back to normal because of the insulin production. whereas person 1 didn't return to normal at all over the 5 hours. However, it did slope down to about 150. So any ideas why it did that? Right, what happened here? So the blood glucose concentration did decrease, but that's just due to respiration. So that's just the process in which glucose is used to make energy. So it's glucose reacting with oxygen. That makes carbon dioxide and water, and energy is released in that process. So energy for movement and regulating body temperature are both used. So that's why it does slope instead of just staying at that high blood glucose concentration. Right, so after the meal, person 1's blood insulin level was increased, So it says, which type of diabetes has person 1 got, and how do you know? Right, so we know that the insulin level increased, which means it's produced. So if we know the pancreas is producing insulin, it has to be type 2. So as insulin is produced, but the cells do not respond by taking in the glucose and converting it to that glycogen. So if the person had type 1 diabetes, there'd be no insulin produced. So that's how we know it's got to be type 2. So this is the next little bit that I want to cover. So it's about the ruler drop test. So if you think you might be able to have a go, just describing how to carry out this test, have a go at that now. Right, so ruler drop. Basically, if we're talking about students, we don't have to put students out. It can be people. So we just put person A, person B, or person 1, person 2. But basically, we need to be able to put in there that there's 2 people required to carry out this test. So person B holds the ruler above person A's hand. Person B drops the ruler, and then person A catches the ruler as quickly as they can. And then the distance the ruler falls is recorded, and we can use that measurement to basically calculate the reaction time of person A. Right? So if we have a go at this, so we've got a bit of an exam question to have a go at. So it's students in a college made this hypothesis. So reaction time will increase as the time you have been awake increases. So they set up an investigation to actually test this hypothesis. And what we mean is just basically a guess what's going to happen, a prediction what will happen. So they found 5 volunteers willing to stay awake for 24 hours, right? And then they kept the volunteers in a room where they can study, use an exercise bike, or watch TV as they wish, so whenever they want. They'll provide them with food, water, coffee, and tea whenever they want as well. And measure the volunteers' reaction time every 4 hours using a computer program. So a different method of measuring reaction time. So the independent variable it's asking for, so for 1 mark straight away. So we need to know our variables off by heart. So independent is just the thing that is changed within an investigation, right? So what was changed this time was the time the volunteers were awake for. It says they measured the volunteers' reaction time every 4 hours using a computer program, so the time changed. And we can see that. I'm just going to skip back to this because we've just looked at the alternative method for measuring reaction time there. So the ruler drop test, we can basically just paste into this exam question, right? So that's where the marks are for, just describing how to carry that out with 2 people. So person A holds the ruler above person B's hand and drops it. Person B catches it, and a measurement's taken from the ruler where person B caught it and used to calculate reaction time. Not too shabby, right? So now we've got a table of results, right? So what we've got is our independent variable on this side here. So the time awake in hours, and we can see it goes up in hours because it's measured every 4 hours. It goes up in 4s, right? So the first thing I want you to do is calculate value x in the table to 2 significant figures, right? We can see value x is in this column where it says mean. So from math, you know that mean is just an average. So all we have to do in this question is average out the column for 16 hours. We need to double check there's no anomalies, so no results that shouldn't be in there. And you can follow the pattern of each volunteer. So it might look like the results are quite different, so 0.44, 0.83 and 0.27. However, if you look down the columns rather than the rows across, what you can see is that each person's reaction time will be naturally different anyway. So person D has always got a faster reaction time, than person C has. So it doesn't. We're not too worried about any anomalies there. So all we'll do is just basically add all the results together, then we'll divide it by 5. And two significant figures. 0 is not a significant figure; it's before the decimal point. So we'll just put in 0.56 as our answer. Right? And it's asking us to describe the pattern of results for a mean reaction time as the time awake increases. Right? So if you want to give it a quick pause and have a go at that, describing is just saying exactly what the results are. So you don't have to explain anything, just saying what happened. So I've just put it up there because I can't fit it on properly. So there was no significant change in the reaction time between 0 and 8 hours awake. So I should have put in there mean reaction time. I'm gonna not very good at writing on this. Right, so mean reaction time. So you can see between 0 and 8 hours, it didn't really change. Whereas between 8 and 24 hours, so between these times, as the time awake increased, so did the reaction time. So the longer the people were awake for, their reaction time increased. So it took them longer to react and catch that ruler. Right, so, I didn't put an animation on this, but two things I should have controlled, so control variables that I should have kept same for all volunteers, was the amount of coffee they drank and the amount of food they were allowed to eat. So the amount of exercise the volunteers had was also something they should have controlled. That's because both of these can impact reaction time. If you exercise and then do this test, it might be different from before you exercise, so it can change your reaction time. And so can things like caffeine in food and drink. Right? So it's important we control that, because we just want to know the effect of how long the people were awake for, rather than the effect of caffeine or how much exercise had on the reaction time. So adaptations, very quick. Thick fur, we're just matching them up, so it's a nice little question to start off. So thick fur, you would just match that up to for insulation. Warning colours would deter predators, and large ears would increase heat loss. Right, so adaptations are things, changes in the body basically, to make that organism suited to the environment that it lives in. So a large ears increases heat loss. You'd expect that animal to live in a hot place, so it can regulate its body temperature better by losing heat. So it's important that we know how to basically divide adaptation into 3 categories. So we can have structural, functional, and behavioural. Right? I'll put an example of each on, and I want you to just give it a quick pause and have a go at working the rest out for yourself. So structural are things that involve the actual structure of the organism. So waterproof feathers would be a structural adaptation. Right? Penguins huddling would be an example of a behavioural adaptation, because it's something that it actually does. And then I'm just going to put reabsorption of water from the feces is an example of functional. So you'd expect an organism that does this to live in quite a dry area where they've got to conserve as much water as they can. So they'll reabsorb it from the poo basically before that's excreted. So give it a quick pause and just see if you can put the rest of them into their categories. Right, so I'll go through them. So hollow bones in birds, we'd put structural. Claws to grip ice, also structural because they involve the actual structure. This is to do with plants. This is a plant adaptation. So conserving water by stomata closing in the day. That would be an example of a functional adaptation, because it's something that happens in the body or in the organism. It's to do with reactions as well. Producing small amounts of concentrated urine, would say that is functional. Right? Meerkats building dens underground. That'd be behavioural. Thick fat and fur for insulation. That would be structural. Right, succulents store water in stems and leaves. Functional. Hibernation, behavioural. Bird migration, so that's just when they fly basically to warmer areas in winter, so they usually fly south. That'd be behavioural, because it's something they do. Lions resting in the shade to avoid heat, behavioural. And producing toxins to avoid being eaten, that'd be functional. And camouflage would be structural, because it's to do with how it looks basically, what you can physically see. Right, so that's how we do that. And then the last little bit is, last couple of bits, carbon cycle, right? So we need to know how basically carbon dioxide cycles through the atmosphere and living things. Right, so we've got some processes going off here. So it says, the first question is, in process A, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is taken into plants. What is process A? Right, so we should know by now that carbon dioxide going into plants is the process of photosynthesis. So I'll stick an X in there. Right, in process B, carbon dioxide is released from plants and animals into the atmosphere. Right, so process B happens in plants and animals because all living things have to respire. Right, they have to carry out this respiration process to produce energy to stay alive. It says, in which process is carbon passed from one organism to another? And that's C, right? So carbon's taken in through photosynthesis into plants, and then animals that eat them plants take on board that carbon dioxide as they're eating the biomass of the plants, right? So we'd say that is process C. And just to get to a bit more of an advanced level, on the next question, I'll give it a minute. So we'll just nip through this one quickly. So just while we're on the topic, so if the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, what it's asking what had happened to the concentration of carbon dioxide if trees were cut down. So we can say that more carbon dioxide there would be more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as there'll be less photosynthesis, right? Two of the greenhouse gases other than carbon dioxide, methane and water vapour. So they're ones that contribute to global warming. And then a type of organism that causes decay is a microorganism. If you go on YouTube, there's a good video. If you put decomposition in, there's a video about how human bodies decay. I think it's the top result if you just search decomposition. Let's have a watch of that. Right. So from the previous question that we did on tick boxes, we want to be able to describe how carbon from the atmosphere is cycled through living things. So if you give it a quick pause, and if you had a 5 marker on that question, what kind of things would you write down? So what I would personally put the letter next to each bit so I can break it down. Or if you had a question where it didn't give you the letters, write the letters next to it so you can separate the processes. So A, plants taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by the process of photosynthesis. Right? C there, animals eat the plants, so they're consuming the carbon dioxide that plants have taken in. And then B, we've got 2 of them. So plants and animals return carbon dioxide to the atmosphere by respiration. And also we've got D. What that is microorganisms cause decay of dead bodies and also the plant waste, which returns carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So that's how carbon dioxide gets more. There's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Right, so we've got some adaptations. So these are examples of plant adaptations. So we have to match them up. So what we've got, it's doing a video, Geeta, for year 11. Screen for adaptations, thanks. So the plant is able to absorb so we've got a list A, which is the adaptation, and list B, how it helps the plant survive. Geeta is rubbish. So large colourful flowers with a strong scent, what that would be is it attracts insects to help it reproduce. Right? Releases poisons into the soil. We would match up with prevents other plants growing too close because it'll poison them and stop them from growing close. And cactus with a swollen stem is able to store lots of water. So the swollen stem is the water storage, right? So we can match them up. And then very quickly, I just wanted to go through this azalea plant like in this list there, in this question here, because we can link that to a bit of natural selection. So the azalea plant on the right, so this one here, has evolved from the azalea plant on the left, which has less colourful flowers, right? So the one on the left is a lighter version, and it's basically an ancestral plant. So this is what we'd see today, and this is the one that this is the same plant basically years ago. It says put the steps in the correct order to explain how the azalea plant has evolved by natural selection. Right, so that's the process of evolution. That's the mechanism. that Darwin discovered. So you have number 1. I'll put number 2 in there for you if you want to have a quick go first. Number 1 is variation, right? Or a mutation. So variation is just differences in characteristics. So that'll mean some plants have more colourful flowers in the first place. And a mutation, so a change in the DNA can cause that. Right? 2, the more colourful plants have the advantage as they're more likely to attract insects that help them reproduce. Right? So the more colourful plants are more likely to attract insects. So they're the ones that will help them. So they're the ones that will be able to reproduce. So the more colourful plants are more likely to survive and reproduce, because they're getting more insects come over to help them. Number 4, the more colourful plants passed on their genes, right? So because they're getting more insects to reproduce, so more bees, they pass on the genes. And then 5, the genes passed on over many generations resulted in the azalea plant evolving to have more colourful flowers. Right, so if we want to tick them off. So then this is the last slide, last 2 slides. So Darwin suggested the theory of natural selection. Just want to go through what that is. It's basically the survival of the fittest, right? So within a species, there'll be organisms that have different characteristics, and that's what we call variation, right? So different characteristics. Some of them will be better suited to survive and reproduce. So because they've got different characteristics, they'll be better suited in their environment, so they're more likely to survive. If they survive, they're more likely to live to a reproductive age where they'll find a mate and reproduce, right? If they reproduce, they'll pass on their genes to the next generation. So that characteristic that's best suited to the environment will be passed on to the next generation of that species, and that'll happen again and again and again until the species evolves. So then we've got a bit of an example of that where we've got 2 species of butterfly. So we've got the question there. And it says this one on the left has a foul taste, which birds do not like. So they've learnt not to prey on it. And this one on the right does not have a what have I done there? Anyway, this one on the right does not have a foul taste, but most birds don't prey on it anyway. So it suggests why most birds do not prey on this one on the right. And that's because the wing pattern's similar. It looks pretty same. So birds just assume it'll be this one, and it'll have a foul taste. So that's basically one of their behavioural adaptations. So it says, suggest an explanation in terms of natural selection for the markings on this one. So why does it look like what it does? How has natural selection caused that? And what we can say is the variation means that some of these butterflies will have just naturally had a wing pattern that was closer to this butterfly, right? So because they were less likely to be eaten because the birds thought the taste dirty, they survived and reproduced with other butterflies of this species, right? So that happened over and over again, and every time they're passing on them genes. So over time, the species of this butterfly will just start looking more like this butterfly, and that's how that works. Right, that's it. Revise now.